if Putin is not willing to meet Trump at least some way towards the center, Trump can then turn around and say, well, look, I tried. I gave all these options. The Russians still aren't willing, and therefore we'll have to double down on support for Ukraine. That is the club he's holding behind his back.
Well, let's get some more on our top story. We have had those talks between the US and Russia on the future of Ukraine. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, pointed to a potential lifting of sanctions. The two countries have agreed to appoint ambassadors. How significant a move is this to end Russia's isolation? I've been speaking to Mark Galeotti, historian, expert on Russian affairs, fellow of the Royal United Services Institute. And I asked him how the negotiations between Washington and Moscow were being viewed in Russia.
It's actually being, obviously, as you'd imagine, being responded to very well in Russia. Firstly, because just the simple fact of the end of isolation. I mean, if one looks at how it's being played in the Russian press, for example, yes, they're quite eager to see what can happen over Ukraine, but they regard it as a sort of a big deal already, the fact that the attempts to essentially isolate Russia, cut it off from certainly the West and as much of the world as possible, that's now over. So there is a real sense that things are moving. On sanctions, I think people are cautious. I think they feel that this is a sort of a carrot that Trump is holding out, and that nothing really substantial will change there until there's some kind of, at the very least, a ceasefire. But generally speaking, I mean, this is obviously from Putin's point of view, but also from most Russians' point of view, a good couple of weeks.
And do you think that President Putin does really want to end the war, and that perhaps he sees an opportunity now that he can keep, well, at least significant amounts of that Ukrainian territory which his troops are occupying?
Yeah, I mean, this is the point. Crawling into Putin's mind is never a very productive or pleasant experience. And it may well be that he's essentially toying with multiple options. This is classic Putin. He doesn't tend to have one very clear, direct strategy. He creates situations that'll give him multiple opportunities. So he may plan to restart the war. But on the other hand, absolutely, for someone who has seen what was meant to be a short, victorious little stroll in to install a puppet government in Kiev, turn into a bloody war which has cost over 500,000 wounded and killed, and maybe much more than that, as well as serious scarring to the Russian economy. If he can walk away from this with about 20% of Ukrainian territory and relief from at least certain of the sanctions, he can certainly spin that as a win.
And given that the US said in advance that Ukraine would have to give up some of its territory, said in advance that NATO membership wasn't going to be on the table for Ukraine at this stage, said that the US wants to significantly reduce its security and financial commitments to Ukraine. I mean, Russia must feel it's onto a winning streak.
To a degree, but look, let's be honest. There was never really much prospect that the Russians would surrender the territories that they've already taken. And likewise, for all the talk about Ukraine in NATO, there was no real prospect of it happening in the foreseeable future. So there is a degree to which Trump is just simply spelling out the obvious. And at the same time, we've got to remember that to Putin, given that his forces are continuing, however great a cost, to continue to drive into Ukrainian territory, from his point of view, actually stopping that advance is a concession. But yes, I mean, broadly speaking, Trump is in some ways laying down a whole load of juicy morsels for Putin to feast on. But the flip side of that is that if Putin is not willing to meet Trump at least some way towards the center, Trump can then turn around and say, well, look, I tried. I gave all these options. The Russians still aren't willing, and therefore we'll have to double down on support for Ukraine. That is the club he's holding behind his back.
We're hearing that there is now a prospect of President Trump meeting President Putin. What do you think that would mean for the Russian leader after 3 years where there's been this broad agreement across the West to isolate him?
I mean, it really will be an extraordinary turnaround, not least because it's not just about sanctions. Remember, this is a man who has an arrest warrant on war crimes charges out from the International Criminal Court. Now, the fact of the matter is that the United States does not recognize that particular court, but still, the spectacle of Trump meeting President Putin at this moment is something that absolutely the Russians would treasure. And in particular, they would play it to the rest of the world, the global south and so forth. Again, as a way of saying, we have basically faced down the West. They've tried their worst, and now they've had to come back to us. It would be a great victory for Putin.
Mark Galeotti, historian, author, expert on Russian affairs, talking to me a little earlier. Pam's got in touch, says Trump is providing Putin with a huge win in exchange for Ukraine's minerals. Putin will have sanctions lifted, no doubt other money-making deals agreed that will benefit America. We need to utilise the Russian funds that have been frozen here, she says, and use them to fund expansion of our defence and help rebuild Ukraine.
The power of weaponry today is, and not only nuclear, but nuclear in particular, the power of weaponry is very important. I said before that I had very constructive talks in my first term with President Putin about the denuclearization of the two countries, and then we were going to go to China after we worked some kind of a deal. And we, at the confines of a deal, I thought he really wanted to do it, so did I, denuclearize. And it's such a beautiful term when you think about it. In other words, to bring it down, because the power of those weapons is too great. And I did speak to President Xi about that, and I was getting also a very good response. He's building a very strong nuclear power. He's not very close to Russia or the United States right now, but he will be soon. I mean, he'll catch up over the period of 4 or 5 years, they say. But it would be a great thing if we could, on a military basis. We're going to spend this year $915 billion on military. Russia, without the war, was spending close to 100, but with the war, I can't tell you what they're spending, but they're spending a lot. And China is spending $400 and $450 billion. A tremendous amount more, with probably $200 billion more going into Ukraine, using for Ukraine to fight. And Europe has not really carried its weight in terms of the money. It's not equitable. And we want to see a counterbalance. We want to have them put up more money. They have to do that. At the same time, we had a very good conversation with President Putin yesterday, and we also had a very good conversation. I did, in both cases, with President Zelensky. And I think we're going to be able to do something. I think we're going to be able to make a deal. And I hope so, because it's a horrible war. It's a very terrible, bloody war with 1.5 million soldiers at least already dead on the battlefield, lying all over the fields like nobody's ever seen anything like it, certainly since the Second World War. And so I think we're going to be able to do something. We're working with President Zelensky and with President Putin. And my impression is that I know that President Zelensky wants to make a deal. And I also feel that I know that President Putin wants to make a deal. I wanted to know that before I began any detailed discussions. But the meeting and the conversation, also the meeting with Steve Witkoff in Moscow, was a very successful one. And my phone call with him was a very successful one.